Wayne County, Indiana, or late October 1907, 20 minutes past 6 in the morning. Frost stood white on the wheel ruts of a township road, and a closed wooden wagon was already a mile and a half into its run. Two horses pulling a half into its run. Two horses pulling at a steady walk that broke into a trot only on the two flat stretches the driver knew could take it. The man on the seat was a tenant farmer who had signed a 1-year contract with the district that spring. Not a teacher, not a constable, not anyone with a certificate in anything. He owned two horses capable of pulling in tandem and a barn, close enough to the route start that the district trustees had considered that qualification enough. He had already let the team find their own pace twice without touching the reins. Once over a culvert he knew would rattle a wheel if taken faster. Once past a gap in the fence line where a farm dog sometimes ran out barking, close enough to a team's legs to cause real trouble if the driver weren't already watching for it before the dog appeared. No contract he had signed mentioned either the culvert or the dog. He had learned both the way he had learned which of H's two horses startled at sudden shade, and which did not, by Dong the Run, 6 mornings out of 7 since March. Behind him, on a bench built along the wagon's inside wall, rather than facing forward, 4 children sat with the other backs to the canvas-lined boards, watching frost-rime fence posts slide past through windows no wider than a loaf of bread. None of them could see the road ahead. None of them needed to. They had already learned without anyone teaching them what the particular sway of the wagon meant when it crossed the culvert, and they braced for it half a second before the wheel found the dip. The driver had not yet reached the first gate of the morning. He already knew, from the angle of smoke rising from a chimney a quarter-mile off, that he was running 2 minutes ahead of schedule, and that the family at that gate would not yet be ready for him. What did this driver know about 4 miles of unimproved township road? The dog, the smoke, the families along it, that the 1-year contract he had signed in March had never once specified, and what, reading backward into a morning they couldn't see coming, had the children on the bench behind him already learned to feel coming before he did? The wagon the driver was running that October morning had been built to a pattern that by 1907, Wayne Works in Richmond, Indiana, had been refining for 15 years. It was not a farm wagon with a roof nailed on. It was a purpose-built enclosed body, windows set into all 4 sides, small enough that a child's head couldn't fit through one, large enough to let light and let the children see the fence lines passing. Inside, the seating ran along the perimeter, a bench down each long wall, facing in, rather than rows facing the direction of travel, and at the back, not the front, was the only door. Each of those choices answered a specific problem. The per meter seating let more cauldrons sink close to the load-bearing walls of a wooden box, of no engineering reason to support forward-facing rows. The windows on every SD meant no child sat in the dark, regardless of which way the wagon was angled to the morning sun. And the rear door, the detail that would outlive every other part of the design, existed because the front of the wagon was occupied by 2 animals with nervous systems, and the simplest way to keep a fidgeting line of children from becoming a spook team and an overturned wagon was to keep all of that activity as far from the horses as the body allowed. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American school bus culture, built from operational fact rather than nostalgia for yellow paint. You don't need a single relative who ever rode a KD hack to feel this. Every yellow bus stall loads has emergency X'd out the back because, more than a century ago, somebody was afraid of spooking a horse. And if you rode a school bus in any era, or drove one, or heard a KD hack story from someone who did, put it in the comments. If your family has roots in rural Indiana, Ohio, or anywhere a one-room school once stood, did anyone ever mention a kid hack, a school hack, or a horse-drawn school car in family stores about getting to school? What were you told? The Richmond, Indiana company that built these wagons spent the next 60 years budding the steel buses as Channel X'd to document, and that story starts exactly where this one ends, back on the wagon route. None of this, the windows, the bench seating, the rear door, was decorating. It was an engineer's answer to a problem that had nothing to do with comfort. Two nervous half-ton animals up front, and the district's only real obligation being to get the children there and back without anyone getting hurt. What the Deskin could not solve was the part that depended entirely on the man holding the reins. By the time the driver reached the family who wasn't ready for him, he had already made a decision the district's one-page contract had never asked him to make. He would idle the team at the gate for 90 seconds, not the full 2 minutes a more cautious man might have allowed, because he knew this family's youngest was reliably first out the door, and the older two were never more than a moot behender. He had learned this the way he had learned everything else about the route, not from the trustees, not from any document, but from roughly 200 mornings spread across 2.5 years. The contract he had signed specified two things: that he would provide a covered vehicle and 2 horses, and that he would transport the cauldron of the Destarks' outling farms to the schoolhouse and back, 5 days a week, for an agreed sum per term. It did not specify which families ran early and which ran late. It did not specify that the second gate's latch stuck in wet weather and cost an extra 30 seconds, or that one of his 2 horses, the older mare, went lame more easily on frozen ruts and needed the lighter hand on a hard frost morning like this one. Nor did it specify anything about the children themselves. A distinct transportation contract in this era typically said nothing about supervision beyond the general expectaton that the driver would see the children safely on and off the vehicle. There was no state licensing exam for the work, no trying course, no certificate beyond owning a suitable wagon, and a temperament the trustees judged steady. The job was, in practice, whatever the driver discovered it to be, once he started doing it: part teamster, part teamkeeper, part the only adult some of these children would see between their own couch and door and the schoolhouse stove. What he cared, after 2.5 years, was not a map of the road. He had that by the first week. What he carried was a working model of an entire morning: which gate ran fast, which ran slow, which dog needed watching, which horse needed the gentler hand on which kind of morning. Assembled the only way it could be assembled, by being wrong about some of it early on, and being corrected by the road itself. What happened to that model, built mile by mile, morning by morning, with no document to record it, when a driver's 1-year contract wasn't renewed? And what riding behind him had the children built that was just as real and just as unrecorded? The children on the bench that morning were not passengers, in the way a child riding in the front seat of a car is a passenger. They sat sideways to the direction of travel, which meant the road itself was something they felt rather than watched. The particular 2-beat jolt of the culvert, the long, smooth stretch where the wagon ran almost silent on packed dirt, the rougher washboard 1/4 mile before the schoolhouse, where every child on the bench instinctively braced a hand against the seat edge before the wagon told them to. None of this had been taught. A parent did not send a child down and explain that the wagon would sway hard at the culvert, or that the temperature inside the enclosed body dropped sharply on the last stretch, where the road ran along open pasture with no windbreak. The children learned it the only way it could be learned, by being cold, twice a day, on the same 4 miles, until the cold itself became something they could predict before it arrived. There was no heat in the wagon beyond the bodies of the children themselves, and whatever wool, oilcloth, or robe a family sent along. The enclosed body kept out wind in most weather, which was already a meaningful improvement over an open farm wagon or a half-mile walk in February. But enclosed did not mean warm. A child's knowledge of this route, then, was not only geographic, it was thermal, the specific knowledge of exactly how cold the last stretch would be, and exactly how to angle a knee against a neighbor's coat to take the worst of tea. It was also social, and a way no contract or trustee meeting ever discussed. Anywhere from 4 to 20 children, depending on the route and the season, shared this narrow wooden box twice a day for years at a stretch, long enough for the youngest child on the bench to grow into the oldest, taking over, without instruction, The unspoken job of telling a frightened 6-year-old on her first morning which jolt was coming and which one meant nothing at all. A child who rode this route for 5 years before reaching the schoolhouse for the last time had absorbed a map of 4 miles of Indiana farm country that existed nowhere on paper, built entirely from cold, from sway, from the voice of an older child saying, "That one's nothing," half a second before a jolt that, the first week, had felt like the wagon was coming apart. What happened to that map when, a few years later, the same children made the same 4 miles in a fraction of the time, in a vehicle that didn't sway the same way at all? None of this, the cold, the sway, the 90-second waits, was the point of the kid hack. It was the cost of it. The point was what the route made possible for families who had no other way to reach the schoolhouse. A farm 4 miles from the nearest schoolhouse was, for a family with no kid hack route, effectively a household that either kept its children home, sent them on a daily walk that could run well over an hour each way in good weather, and become genuinely dangerous in bad, or put a young child on a horse of their own, and turned the animal loose to graze near the schoolyard until the day ended. All 3 of these were real opt-ins, and all 3 were no use across rural America. I'd chalkis parode, for families a route done reach. None of them scaled past a handful of children per family, and none of them worked well for a 6-year-old. What the kid hack did was pull the problem. 1 contracted wagon, 1 driver, 1 team of horses, could do for 11 or 15 or 20 children scattered across several farms, what no single family could do for its own 2 or 3. Turn an impossible daily distance into a manageable one, on a fixed schedule, with 1 adult responsible for getting everyone there and back. For a family at the far edge of a district, beyond comfortable walking distance, but not so far that a wagon couldn't reach them within a reasonable morning. The difference between the route existing and not existing was, in practical terms, the difference between a child attending the consolidated district school and a child not attending school at all, or attending an even smaller, closer school, with a handful of pupils and a single teacher covering 8 grades. This is what made the kid hack, for all its cold mornings and unrecorded knowledge, a piece of educational infrastructure rather than merely a convenience. It did not create the schoolhouse at the end of the route, but it determined how many of the district's farms could reasonably be asked to send their children there. And by extension, how large and how consolidated a rural school district could practically become before the horse itself became the limiting factor. To understand why a wagon like this existed at all, built to a specific pattern, with windows on every side and a door at the back, you need to understand what was happening 60 miles northeast, in Richmond, Indiana. In the years before this driver ever took up the reins, Wayne Works had not started out building anything for children. The firm traced back to an 1837 foundry in Dublin, Indiana, a few miles from Richmond, making stoves and farm implements. By 1871, it had reorganized as the Wayne Agricultural Company, and by the mid-1870s, it had relocated to Richmond and grown into a substantial maker of mowers, reapers, grain drills, and cultivators, shipped to dealers across the rural Midwest and beyond. It was exactly the kind of farm a farm county would already know by reputation. Not a transportation company, a farm implement company. That changed in 1892, when the school district in Kingsville, Ashtabula County, Ohio, more than 100 miles from Richmond, asked Wayne to build something the company had never made before. A special wagon to carry children to and from school. There was no school bus industry to turn to in 1892, because there was no school bus industry yet. A district that needed one did what this Ohio district did. It went to a wagon and implement maker it already trusted and described the problem. Wayne's answer, the enclosed body, the windows on every side, the bench along each wall, the door at the back, became, in effect, the template. Other districts, hearing about the Kingsville job or simply facing the same problem, ordered the same pattern. This is also where the route's true limitation lived. Not in the driver's skill or the wagon's design, both fully worked out by 1907, but in the animal pulling it. A horse-drawn route had a hard ceiling on how much ground it could cover in a morning that still left children fresh enough to sit through a school day, and the driver fresh enough to do the run again that afternoon. Push the route too long and the horses tired. The morning ran late, and a hard winter morning could turn an already long route into one the team genuinely couldn't safely finish. This is why, in 1892, and for the 2 decades after it, school consolidation in rural America stayed local. A district might combine 2 or 3 small schools into one, but rarely more, because the kid hack's range was the range of a horse, walking and trotting a fixed number of miles before it needed rest. What changes for a route like this one? The day the limiting factor stops being the horse. By 1914, the wagon pattern that had carried children across rural Indiana and Ohio for more than 2 decades met a machine it had never been designed for. Wayne Works, the same Richmond, Indiana. Farm that had same Richmond, Indiana. Farm that had built the Kingsville job in 1892 took one of its wooden kid hack bodies, the same enclosed shape, the same perimeter benches, the same rear door, and mounted it onto an automobile chassis instead of a set of horse-drawn running gear. It was among the earliest motorized school vehicles built in the country, and the company that built it had been building the horse-drawn version for 22 years already. What changed was, in one sense, everything, and in another sense, almost nothing. The body itself, the part the children actually rode inside, kept its shape. Windows on every side, a bench down each wall, facing in. The rear door, never relocated to the front, because nobody yet had a reason to relocate it. The front of the vehicle now held an engine instead of a horse. But the habit of loading children well clear of whatever was doing the pulling had already become the unquestioned default. What had not yet been solved was the question of how to get the horse to pull the wagon. What had not yet been solved was weather. The earliest motorized kid hacks were not fully enclosed and glazed the way the wooden wagon bodies had been. Many ran with open SDs or canvas, stretched over the frame rather than fixed walls and windows, meaning a faster yard could also be a colder, wetter one until the body design caught up with the chassis underneath it. For years afterward, the two systems didn't simply replace one another. They ran side by side, sometimes as the very same vehicle. Wayne's catalogs from the early 1920s describe combination transportation bodies built to be lifted off a motorized truck chassis and remounted on horse-drawn running gear, and back again, depending on the season. A motor for the dry months, a team for the months when an unimproved road turned to mud or snow. No truck of the period could reliably manage. A district did not have to choose once between horse and engine. For a stretch of years, it could own one wooden body and choose, route by route and month by month, which power, horse or motor, was going to pull it that week. What did a driver who ran the same wooden body behind 2 horses in March and behind an engine in July need to know that the man who had only ever driven one or the other did not? The driver who worked a route through this transitional stretch, and there were drivers across rural Indiana and Ohio who did exactly this for a decade or more, carried 2 almost entirely separate bodies of knowledge inside one job. The horse knowledge didn't disappear the day an engine arrived. It simply stopped being needed every day. A man who could read a team's ears for the first sign of fright still needed that skill in the months the body sat on running gear. The same man, the same week, might also need to know how a borrowed truck engine behaved on a cold start, which gear to hold on a grade no horse had ever struggled with, and how much further a tank of fuel could stretch a route than a team's stamina ever could. What didn't change at all was the route knowledge. Which family ran early? Which gate stuck? Which stretch flooded first after rain? None of that depended on what was doing the pulling, and none of it transferred automatically to a new driver just because that driver had never touched a horse in his life. The years a man might spend learning a road were, in this sense, separable from the years he spent learning an engine, and a distinct that lost an experienced horse and wagon driver, lost both candies of knowledge at once, even though only one of them hadn't thought to do with the new Machna parked in the barn. For the children, The experience held its shape longer than anyone might have expected. The same perimeter bench, the same small windows, or for a few years, no windows at all, just canvas snapping in the wind where glass would eventually go. The same rear door, climbed in the same way, by children whose grandparents would one day tell their own grandchildren that the bus style loaded from the back, most of them never known and the reason traced to a horse none of them had ever met. What was being quietly built toward, underneath all of this improvisation, the combination bodies, the canvas sides, the same wooden shape riding behind two completely different kinds of power, was a moment when the body itself would stop being something you could lift off and remount on anything at all. That moment did not arrive all at once. Through the second half of the 1920s, body manufacturers, Wayne Works among them, began bolt-knob hack-style bodies, bolting KD hack-style boats permanently onto a truck chassis rather than bolting them as ounce. A duster could loft between a wagon's running gear and a motor frame depending on the season. The body stopped traveling between two machines. It belonged to one machine now, and the wood it had always been built from started taking on a skin of sheet steel over the original frame. Not yet a steel structure, but no longer simply a wagon shape wrapped in canvas and timber either. By 1930, Wayne had gone further. That year's catalog offered a body built entirely of steel. No wood frame under the panels, no canvas anywhere in the passenger compartment, fitted with safety glass where a generation of kid hacks had used small fixed openings barely wider than a loaf of bread. Wayne was not alone in reaching this point in 1930. A competing bodybuilder, Superior, announced an all-steel body of its own that same year. And because the body was now being designed from the ground up rather than adapted from a wagon, the entry point moved with it, forward, to the side of the vehicle near the driver, where a door he could work from his own seat let children board without anyone walking the bus's length to reach them. The door at the back stayed. From this point on, it was a second door, used only when the first one couldn't be. None of this happened to a country that had already finished consolidating its rural schools. As late as 1930, half of the nation's school children still lived outside its towns and cities, and a great many of them were still served, however unevenly, by exactly the kind of one-room schoolhouse that motorized transportation was only beginning to make impractical. A steel-bodied bus rolling out of Richmond in 1930 did not retire every kid hackened in 1930, did not retire every kid hack still working a rural route that same year. Districts kept what they could afford for as long as it ran. Wood and horse and steel and engine overlapped for years, county by county, at whatever pace a district's budget allowed. What this new body asked of a driver was, in its mechanics, genuinely new. A heavier vehicle, a different door to operate, glass to keep clear instead of canvas to keep lashed down against weather. But the route underneath it had not changed at all. The family that ran early, the gate that stuck, the stretch that flooded first after rain. None of it had moved an inch because the body riding over it was steel now instead of wood. And a child climbing aboard a new 1930 Wayne steel bus still found, once inside, a bench running along each wall instead of rows facing forward. The same seating arrangement an older sibling might have ridden in a wagon 15 years before. Inside a vehicle that, in almost every other respect, no longer resembled that wagon at all. 38 years had changed the wagon's material, its power source, its door, even its windows. What had it left completely alone, and what does that tell us about what a kid hack actually was?